Oh, there we go. Okay. All right, that's better. All right. All right, so again, looking at Paul, well, when he first got to Jerusalem, there was no small stir that he was there. You know, there were Jews that were from Asia that would have seen Paul, and they says, this is the man that caused this big stir. And so they grab Paul and they bring him and they start to beat him. And they get to the point where they're looking to kill Paul. But we see that there was an answered prayer there, and that Paul would have been essentially rescued by the Roman soldiers there. And you get to chapter 22 as the Roman soldiers, they're carrying Paul away, that Paul will get to the stairway. And he addresses the Jews here. He's telling them about why he's doing the things that he is doing. That Jesus would have came to him as he was on the road to Damascus, and he would have told him to go to the Gentiles. And that's kind of a little summary of what chapter 22 would have insisted on. And so after Paul says that he would have went to the Gentiles, well, they did not like that. The Jews did not like that. And so they're going and say, look, away with this individual. He should not be deserving to live. And so as this is going on, well, the Roman soldiers, they go and they take Paul. And they, want to examine him to really see what is going on here. And as they're about to beat Paul, where Paul says, I'm a Roman citizen. You can't beat me. I'm not condemned. And so as Paul brings this to their attention, well, they stop with trying to beat Paul. They let him go. But on the next day in verse 30 of chapter 22, it says that they would have wished to know for certain why Paul would have been accused by the Jews. So they released him and ordered the chief priest and all the council to assemble. And they brought Paul down and set him before them. And that's where we pick up in verse 1 of chapter 23. And in verse 1, it says that Paul, looking intently at the council, said, "Brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day." The high priest Ananias commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Do you sit to try me according to the law, and in violation of the law order me to be struck?" But the bystanders, verse 4, said, "Do you revile God's high priest?" And Paul said, "Well, I was not aware, brethren, that he was high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people." And so just to kind of look at the things that Paul says here, you look in verse 1, where he talks about this conscience that he has. It is something that he's brought up in a couple of times, really. But he says that he has lived with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day. And you look at this word here, the literal translation of conscience would mean with knowledge. And you think back to what Paul would have done back in Acts chapter 7 and 8, that in chapter 7, he would have been in a hearty agreement with putting Stephen, God's disciple, to death. He would have been in agreement with that. And then in chapters 8, he goes on to make this great persecution to the church. He goes and he looks and he goes to even these different cities to persecute Christians, to put them in prison. And he does all this with a perfectly good conscience. Paul had not violated what he knew about God's will. But we understand that after he was pursuing Christians, that on the road to Damascus, Jesus Sorry about that.
These poor rookies.
I'm not speaking loud enough? Oh, man. All righty. All righty. There we go. All right, so looking back at the text and what Paul would have said regarding this, that he would have lived with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day. You know, what happens after is pretty shocking. You see that Ananias, he would command those that were by Paul to strike him. I'm not sure if this was a punch or a slap, but either or, it doesn't feel good, you know, to be hit, to be struck in on the mouth. And after that, this is what Paul says. And I like how he doesn't, he doesn't address the person that would have struck him, but he would have addressed the person that would have commanded him to be struck, which was Ananias. And so he tells Ananias, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. And you talk about offensive, even when I'm reading this out loud, I'm like, did I say something bad? But he's addressing Paul, and this description of Ananias was accurate. You look at Ananias, well, he was as corrupt as they come. He was a Sadducee who would use his position for personal gain. This man Ananias was corrupt. He was arrogant. He showed no honest moral principles. You look at Jesus and what he said in Matthew chapter 23, verse 27 about these types of individuals. He would say, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. You can kind of picture this in your head that, someone is looking good on the outside. Look at these high priests. Well, they had to wear certain type of garments that were not, something that probably would have been really cheap. It looked good. They looked the part on the outside. But on the inside, that was not the case. On the inside, they were evil. They were unclean. And that is the case here. Again, Paul's description of Ananias was accurate. He uses that same wording that Jesus would have used, that whitewashed tombs. He says that Ananias is a whitewashed wall. And he goes on not only saying that what Ananias is, but he even prophesies about what is going to happen to Ananias. He says that God is going to strike him down. And if later on, actually a couple years later, there were some Jewish zealots that would have assassinated this high priest a couple of years later. And according to Josephus, in the attack of the Sicarii upon Jerusalem in 67 AD, this man Ananias, he was dragged from his hiding place in a sewer of the palace and murdered. You can kind of see this imagery of how things are played out. That Ananias, he's this evil and corrupt man, but he is that on the inside. And on the outside, he seems to be doing good. But you look at how he was assassinated. Well, he was hiding when the Jewish zealots found him. He was hiding under this sewer. He was hiding who he really was until these Jewish zealots, they would have brought him out into the light and for all to see, and he would have then been murdered. And so I think that's pretty interesting to look at. And concerning what else Paul would have said to him, he kind of questions him. He says, look, do you sit to try me according to the law, and in violation of the law order me to be struck? Well, Paul is referring back to Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 1 and 2, where in the Mosaic law, it says, if there is a dispute between man and they go to court, and the judges decide their case, and they justify the righteous and condemn the wicked, then it shall be, if the wicked man deserves to be beaten, well, the judge shall then make him lie down and be beaten in his presence with the number of stripes according to his guilt. And so that's according to the law, that a man was to be beaten if he was condemned. If he was guilty of something, well, then he would then be beaten. But this wasn't the case here. That Ananias, Paul was not condemned. Ananias just I mean, I'm not exactly sure what was going through his head, but he just wants to do this out of sheer anger, sheer hate for Paul. But he just does this. He commands someone to slap Paul because he wanted it. It wasn't anything according to the law. And so he was doing this in violation of the very law that he tried to see himself as upholding. And so that's pretty interesting and kind of adds to his character of one who is a hypocrite. And so after this, we see that there is a shocking, that the bystanders in verse 4 would have questioned Paul. He says, look, do you revile God's high priest? And Paul would say in verse 5, I was not aware that he was high priest. Now, there are two ways we can kind of look at what Paul is saying here. In verse 5, Paul may have not known who the high priest was at that time. I mean, it was constantly changing. You know, once one man would die, then another man would come about. But Paul, he probably did not know, who the high priest was at that time. And so he was speaking truth here. Now, we either can take that approach, or we can also look at another approach that Paul would have only recognized Jesus as the true high priest. I mean, at this time, we understand that, Paul, he's not under the law. He does not have to follow the law because all that was done away with. And now they are under a new covenant. And the book of Hebrews will talk about this, about Jesus being that better high priest, the one that the old law would always point to because he lasts forever. He doesn't die like the old priest would have been doing. And so we just kind of see that there. But Paul moves on from this, and he would scan the crowd. He would scan the council here, and he looks and he sees one part being Pharisees and the other part being Sadducees. And so what he says in verse 6, brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am on trial for the hope and the resurrection of the dead. And so this was no small stir about what he said, as again, there was one crowd was Pharisees and the other was Sadducees. Well, what was so big about that? Well, it kind of says in the text that the Sadducees, they wouldn't believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe in the Spirit. They didn't believe even in the angel. But it says in verse 8, but the Pharisees, they acknowledged them all. And so with Paul saying this, this caused a dissension there. And it would go on to say that there were those that were of the Pharisaic party that would stand up in verse 9. And it began to argue heatedly, kind of appearing to be on Paul's side and saying, look, this man he's done, we find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him. Now, the people that would have said this, again, they would have been from the side of the Pharisees. And it seems as if they are defending Paul, as if they care for Paul's well-being. But in all reality, they were only referring to Paul's conversation about the resurrection. They're saying, look, Paul is right about the resurrection, that there will be a resurrection. That there is spirits, there is these things. We believe that. And so they're agreeing with Paul, but not saying this for Paul's well-being. They're only saying this, they're only agreeing with Paul here only because they would have opposed the Sadducees. To say this seemed to be a convenience for them. And so we see that it is the case, and as the dissension continues to develop, the commander in verse 10, he would bring Paul to the barracks. And it says in verse 11, but on the night immediately following, the Lord stood at his side and said, take courage, for as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must witness at Rome also. And this is really the second time we specifically see Jesus encourage Paul in our study in the book of Acts. The first time we see was in Acts chapter 18, verse 9 and 10. And not saying that Jesus never would have spoken to Paul other than these two times. But I'm just saying in our study, we have seen so far that, Jesus would literally go to Paul and encourage him to continue on in this. So this is the second time we see Jesus going to Paul and encouraging him. And Paul was told, he was told by Jesus that he was going to Rome, which was also Paul's prayer. In Romans chapter 1, verse 10, and in chapters 15, verse 30 and 32, where Paul, he was talking to the Roman brethren, and he was saying, look, I want to come to you. Pray for me, and I'm going to be praying that we may be able to meet soon. And that was Paul's prayer, that he wanted to go to Rome. Well, with what Jesus just said to Paul in verse 11 kind of confirmed that Paul was going to go to Rome. And so this was an answered prayer here, because we understand when Jesus says something, it's going to happen. And so this was just an answered prayer here. And we see after this, in verse 12, it says that there was a conspiracy to kill Paul. There was some man that would have got together. It says that there would have been over more than 40 men that would have made an oath. They said, look, we're not going to eat or drink until Paul is dead, until we kill Paul. And what they do in verse 14, it says that they came to the chief priest and the elders and said, look, we have bound ourselves under a solemn oath to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. And they'll go on to say in verse 15, look, let's do this. Let's plan to do this. Get with the council, get with the commander that is holding Paul and kind of bring him back down to inquire more about who Paul is or what Paul follows. And as he is on the way to go to the commander, look, we're going to go in and we're going to make an ambush for him and we're going to kill him. And here we see in verse, as this conspiracy is being plotted and as these people are trying to kill Paul, well, we just see the providence of God here. You look in verse 16, we see that, although things may seem bad and that people are planning to kill Paul, well, God's providence is there. After they're discussing all of these different things, it says in verse 16, but, you see that conjunction there, but the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, and he came and entered the barracks and told Paul. And so again, we see that God's providence is clearly there, that these people are planning to do bad to Paul, but it won't come to pass. Because Jesus said that, look, Paul, you're going to go to Jerusalem. You're going to go to Rome. You're going to make it there. And again, when Jesus says something, it's going to happen. These people are trying to plot to kill Paul, but it's not going to happen here. Paul, you are not going to die right now here in Jerusalem. And so again, we just see the providence of God there. And as the son of Paul's sister, Paul's nephew, if you will, he would come and he would tell the centurion what he has heard from these people. And the centurion, he would go to this commander, Lysias, the commander, and he would tell him of what happens. And there was no small stir of what Lysias would do. He wouldn't just say, all right, well, thank you for that. He sent him away and just don't do anything about it. No, he gets word about what is going to happen or what the Jews are planning to do. And he told the young man to go in verse 22. He told him to tell no one. And then what he does after is in verse 23. He tells 2 centurions here to get 200 soldiers ready by the 3rd hour of the night to proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. And so you kind of see just the overpower that he would have had. You're looking at just one man. There's only one man that needs to be delivered to Caesarea. Why go through so much trouble here? But if you look at the opposing side, there's over 40 men that is trying to kill Paul. And these are not just regular men, but these are desperate men. They're under an oath. They're saying, look, we're not going to eat, we're not going to drink until we kill Paul. That puts them in a very high place to say, look, whatever it takes, we are going to kill Paul. So you see that the Roman Lysias, he would get together and he would bring about 200 soldiers. He would get 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen, just to deliver Paul to Caesarea. And he would deliver him to go over to Felix, the governor, kind of hear about, send over to Felix, the governor, about this case. And so he gets all of these people together here, and he sends a letter. He writes this letter starting in verse 26, saying, Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. When this man was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, I came up to them with the troops and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. And wanting to ascertain the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. And I found him to be accused over questions about their law, but under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. When I was informed that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, also instructing his accusers to bring charges against him before you. And so when you're reading this letter, it's kind of a summarization of everything that is going on. But I think it's important to note that Lysias doesn't exactly say everything that needs to be said here. You know, he kind of leaves out the part where they would have put Paul in chains and almost beat him, because that was something that would have put him in this bad spotlight and probably would have been punishable, that he would have been punished for. Because if you remember, as this was happening, as they were about to beat Paul, but they found out that he was Roman, well, they were scared. You know, they were scared that they put Paul in chains and that they were about to beat him. So they let him go really quick. And so you just see the letter that Lysias, he would have left out that small note there and trying to make it to where he was the hero in the situation. So I think that's pretty funny there. But we look to where they send Paul over to Antipatris, and we can see this on the map here. They would go from Jerusalem over to Antipatris, and then from Antipatris they would make their way to Caesarea, which would be about 26 miles north. And as they're doing this, you know, they first start off with going by night. It says that they would have put all this together, I believe it says the third hour of the night. That would have been around 9 p.m. if you will. And so they're making this, they make their way over to Caesarea, and they finally get to where Felix is. They give him this letter. He reads it later on. He would say to Paul in verse 35, I will give you a hearing after your accusers arrive also, giving orders for him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. And so I know we're kind of speeding through this. I'm trying to get through 2 chapters. I know I don't have much time here, but just a little bit of background before we get into chapter 24 about Felix, the governor. You know, he wasn't someone that was seen as being an honorable governor. Concerning his wife, which we'll read about a little later, her name was Drusilla, the Jewish. And she was one that was previously married to a king from a distant land. But Felix saw her and that she was very beautiful, so he would go and he would seduce her, you know, to the point where now it ends up being his wife. You know, Felix is not a good person. You know, he's looked at as being someone who reveled in cruelty and lust. And you look at people like Ananias, who we learned about as being really corrupt. You know, someone who looks good on the outside, but on the inside, they're dead, they're unclean. Well, the only real difference between the high priest Ananias and Felix the governor is their background. You know, one's Roman, one's Jewish, but they're both corrupt. And so that's just a little bit about Felix the governor here. When we look at verse 1 of chapter 24, it says, after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders, with an attorney named Tertullus, and they brought charges to the governor against Paul. And so after 5 days, these men would come that would have accused Paul, bring about all these charges to try to kill Paul. And they finally make their way to Caesarea as well, to go before Felix the governor and talk about, you know, why Paul needs to be in prison, why he needs to die, you know. And so they bring Tertullus here, who is an attorney. You know, he's known to be looked at as someone who speaks wisely. He has a way with words. And you'll kind of see why that is the case as he starts in verse 3. He'll start with flattering Felix, trying to get on his good side. You know, we won't take the time to read, we won't take the time to Won't take the time to read all of it, but again, he's starting by flattering Felix. He's saying, look, the Jews, we are all thankful for all that you have done, Felix. You know, we're just thankful. You know, you did all of this stuff for us, and man, we really appreciate you. And so he's starting by flattering, trying to get on Felix's good side. But in all reality, I mean, this is not the truth. That Felix, the way the Jews would have seen Felix, he was not a good person. You know, there were times where he probably would have persecuted the Jews just because he didn't like them, that they were Jews and he was a Roman. And so we see that Tertullus, he already is starting off with a lie. And in verse 5, he continues on with 3 charges, which Paul will address each of these. You know, the first charge we read, a lot of it is tied in verse 5, which we will read. He says in verse 5, for we have found this man a real pest, and a fellow who first stirs up dissension among all the Jews throughout the world. The second charge, he's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. And then in the third, verse 6, he even tried to desecrate the temple. And so we see these 3 charges. And in verse 9, you see that this is not something that he is only saying. It says that in verse 9, the Jews also joined in the attack, asserting that these things were so. And so Paul, he would address all 3 of these charges here. If you look at starting in verse 10, Paul would respond, knowing that for many years you have been a judge, Felix the governor, to this nation, I cheerfully make my decision. You see, when Paul starts to make his defense, well, he addresses Felix for who he is. He's not trying to flatter him like Tertullus was doing. You know, he just simply speaks the truth. Felix, you're a judge. You know, you have been a judge for many years. Now let me make my case. Let me make my defense for these charges that were brought up against me. He says in verse 11, since you can take note of the fact that no more than 12 days ago, I went up to Jerusalem to worship. Neither in the temple, nor in the synagogues, nor in the city itself did they find me carrying on a discussion with anyone or causing a riot. Verse 13, nor can they prove to you the charges of which they now accuse me. So the first charge is that they said that Paul would have stirred up dissensions. He would have caused all these different riots. Well, Paul answers that in verse 11 to 13, pretty much saying, where's the proof? You know, where's the proof that I did all of this? You understand that I went to Jerusalem to worship. In verse 13, they can't prove to you the charges of which they now accuse me. And so that the first charge is out the window. He goes on in verse 14 through 16 to address the second charge. The second charge was that Paul was a ringleader of a sect. You know, it wasn't an actual religion. It was kind of a branch off of it. It was a sect. But Paul goes on in verse 14 saying, but this I admit to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I do serve the God of our fathers, believing everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men cherish themselves. There shall certainly be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. And so concerning the second charge that Paul was a ringleader of a sect, well, Paul we can summarize this in verse 14 through 16 that, well, first of all, the way that I'm on trial for right now, it's not a sect. It's actually, you know, when you implemented that the Jews could worship, that the Jews, you know, they were allowed to worship. Well, concerning the things that they believe, concerning the one God that they believe, well, this is all pointing to the way in which I worship. You know, the prophets in the old, they talked about this time. They talked about the time where Jesus would come. And all these things, this is, you know, I'm not a part of a sect pretty much. And so that second charge is out the window. And we get to the point where Paul addresses the third charge. The third charge, it says that he tried to desecrate the temple. And picking up in verse 17, he answers that and says, look, now after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings, in which they found me occupied in the temple, having been purified without any crowd or uproar. But there were some Jews from Asia who ought to have been present before you and to make accusation if they should have anything against me. Or else let these men themselves tell what misdeed they found when I stood before the council. And so kind of summarizing this here, he's saying like there was no evidence of me defiling the temple. You go back to the time that this charge was made, that these Jews from Asia, well, there was supposition going on. They seen Paul and they says, look, this is the man that has, done all of these bad things. And not only that, but this is the man, he has brought one of the Gentiles who was an Ephesian, he has brought him into the temple. But that wasn't a fact. They just thought that he would have brought him into the temple because they seen that Paul was with this Ephesian in the city. And so all of this it won't stand up in court, as we say today. And so Paul addresses each of these things, to the point that there's nothing that should be done about this. And after all of this is said, that both make their defenses, it says in verse 22, but Felix, having a more excellent knowledge about the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias, the commander, comes down, I will decide your case. Verse 23, then he gave orders to the centurion for him to be kept in custody and yet have some freedom, and not to prevent any of his friends from ministering to him. And so this in verse 22 and 23, we kind of see where it says that Felix, he had a more exact knowledge about the way. We're not exactly told how Felix would have known about the Christians, known about people that would have followed the way. But we can kind of look at a couple of things here. Felix, he was a governor of some time, I believe, for Samaria, right? And so he was a governor of some time for Samaria. And so he would have spent some time there, and he would have learned about Christians or people that would have followed the way in that time. That could have been the case where he would have had a more exact knowledge about the way. Or also, you look at his wife. His wife is by Drusilla, which we read in verse 24. His wife Drusilla, again, she was a Jew. You kind of look at their family here. She wasn't from a family that we see as being good. It says that she was great granddaughter of Herod the Great. Not only that, she was the niece of Herod Antipas, who beheaded John the Baptist. She was the daughter of Agrippa I, who martyred James. And she was the sister of both Herod Agrippa II and Bernice, which I believe Josh will talk more chapter 25. And so she's not really coming from the best of backgrounds here, but we see something that they do in verse 24. You see, it says, but some days later, Felix arrived with Drusilla, his wife, who was a Jewess, and sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. And so just stopping right there really quick, we understand that, we're not really sure if it's Felix or Drusilla, one or the other or both, but we see that they want to really know more about the faith. And so what Paul does, he puts this little sermonette or sermon together. Not really sure how long it is, but this is something that I do need to take notes on, because he uses three things here: righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. He starts by talking about righteousness. We see that in verse 25, but as he was discussing righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, concerning righteousness, righteousness implies obedience to the Lord's command. This is something for Felix. He was unaccustomed to submitting to no one else except Rome and except himself. So with Felix and righteousness, not really sure if Felix likes the sound of that. Concerning the second thing that Paul talks about concerning the faith is self-control. Dealing with self-control, one's life is needed to be directed by God's will. That is something, Felix, he probably wasn't going to do. Felix's whole life lived what was a lack of self-control. if he wanted something, then he would probably do whatever he needs to do to get it. There's no self-restraint there. There's no self-control. He wants to be directed by what he wants to do rather than someone else, like Paul's God. And so that was another thing. And you look at the last thing that Paul talks about is the judgment to come. This is not judgment talking about, well, the Jews, one day they're going to be, the temple is going to be torn away with. We know that was in, I believe, 70 A.D. This is not that judgment, but this is talking about the judgment to come where all men are going to be judged for the things that they have done. And so when Paul is talking about this judgment to come, we understand Felix, a lot of times when someone is preaching a sermon, we may say, oh, that sermon was just for me. Well, that's kind of how it is for Felix right now. Concerning the judgment, well, although Felix seems to be the judge in Paul's case, well, there is a judge who will judge even Felix for the things that he has done. And so as Paul talks about these three things, we see after that, it says that Felix became frightened. That's what the word does sometimes. But Felix became frightened, and he said, go away for the present, and when I find time, I will summon you. And so we see that this is something that really, cut him. But, we don't read anywhere about him requiring or requesting Paul to come back to talk about his faith. So we're not sure if he was saved later on. The Bible does not give us, but, he kind of puts it off of trying to hear about the faith. And you look in verse 26, at the same time, too, he was hoping that money would be given him by Paul. Therefore, he also used to send for him quite often and converse with him. Now, the reason for this was that if you remember back in verse 17, Paul would have talked about him coming to Jerusalem to give alms. He was trying to give this contribution from the saints in Achaia and the predominantly Gentile congregation to the needy saints in Jerusalem. So he was carrying money to give to the saints here. And perhaps Felix thought that, well, Paul has some money, or his friends have some money. Perhaps, if he just bribes me, then I can let him go. And so he would send for Paul quite often to converse with him. But we understand that Paul would not do that. It says in verse 27, but after 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus in wishing to do the Jews a favor. Felix left Paul in prison. And so that's pretty much all I have there. Again, I know I sped through this, trying to get through 2 chapters. Any questions or comments before we close? All righty, again. Oh, yep.
When people have time, if you read, the term providence is only used twice in the New Testament, and it's only used here in Acts 24:2 talking about Felix, and it's used in Romans 13:4 talking about us. But Acts 24:2 tells what it is, and providence is Felix looking ahead to what he wants to accomplish, which is peace and prosperity, and he uses those things under his control to accomplish it. And it's the same thing that God would, or Peter would say concerning God in Acts, the 4th chapter and verse 27, that God used the Gentiles, the children of Israel, Pontius Pilate and Herod, to do whatever his hand purposed beforehand to be done. What it says is God uses those things under his control to accomplish what he sees and wants to accomplish. Felix used those things under his control to accomplish peace and prosperity for the land. So it tells us what providence is. And in Romans 13:14 it says, put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no providence or provision for the flesh. We shouldn't look forward to the flesh and use those things at our disposal to accomplish.
Yeah. Oh, no, that's really good. Definitely. I mean, you just look at the difference between the providence of God and how it kind of explains that here as well. Thank you for that. Again, thank you all for your time. I know it was quick, but I believe Josh will go over chapters 25 and 26 this upcoming Lord's Day. Thank you.